The morning Juliana Reyes decided she would leave Springerville, Arizona Territory, forever, was the same morning the cowboy finally looked up at her window and smiled. She had been watching him for 3 months now, ever since her father's general store had become her prison and responsibility after his sudden death from pneumonia, that harsh winter of 1883. Every morning at 7:30, the tall cowboy with sun-bleached hair would ride down Main Street on his Palomino mare, heading toward the cattle ranch that sprawled across the eastern valley. Juliana would stand at her second-floor window, coffee cup warming her hands, and watch him pass. She told herself it was merely routine, something to mark the passage of time in days that all bled together in monotonous shades of brown and dust. But the truth pressed against her ribs like a secret too large to contain. She had memorized the way he sat in the saddle, the angle of his hat, the patient way he handled his horse. She had built entire conversations with him in her mind, imagined the sound of his laugh, wondered if his hands were calloused or gentle or both. That morning, as spring struggled to assert itself against the desert chill, Juliana stood at her usual post with her coffee going cold. She had spent the previous night poring over her father's ledgers, realizing with creeping horror that the store was drowning in debt. The local banker, a thin-lipped man named Crowley, had made his intentions clear over the past weeks. He wanted the property, wanted her out, and was willing to wait only until the end of the month. 23 years old, unmarried, and alone in a territory that ate up the unprepared, Juliana had decided that San Francisco was her only option. She had an aunt there who had written once, years ago, offering refuge if ever it was needed. The cowboy appeared right on schedule, his horse's hooves making their familiar clip-clop rhythm on the packed Earth Street. Juliana watched with particular attention this morning, knowing it would be one of her last chances. She was committing him to memory, this stranger who had become part of her daily ritual, when something unprecedented happened. He slowed his horse. Right there in front of her building, he pulled back on the reins and his mare halted. Then he tilted his head back, pushed his hat up slightly with one finger, and looked directly at her window. Their eyes met across the distance of 20 feet and 1 story. His face, which she had only seen in profile or from above, was suddenly real and immediate. Strong jaw, lines around his eyes from squinting in the sun, a mouth that curved upward in a smile that transformed his entire face from serious to radiant. Juliana nearly dropped her coffee cup. Her heart slammed against her ribs as if trying to escape. The cowboy touched 2 fingers to his hat brim in a small salute, that smile still playing on his lips, and then he clicked his tongue, and his mare resumed walking. He disappeared down the street, leaving Juliana frozen at her window, her carefully constructed plans suddenly feeling like a betrayal of something she could not name. She stood there for a full minute after he vanished from sight, her reflection in the glass showing flushed cheeks and wide eyes. Then reality crashed back. A smile did not pay debts. A smile did not save a failing store. A smile did not change the fact that Crowley would own this building in 3 weeks unless a miracle occurred. Juliana turned from the window and descended the narrow stairs to the store below. The space smelled of leather and tobacco, flour and coffee beans, all the scents that reminded her of her father. Diego Reyes had been a dreamer, generous to a fault, extending credit to families who could not pay and refusing to press them for what they owed. He had died beloved by the community and nearly bankrupt, leaving Juliana to untangle the mess. She unlocked the front door and flipped the sign to open just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, flooding the street with harsh light. The morning routine began. Old Mrs. Patterson came in for thread. Young Tommy Erickson needed nails for his father. The widow Sullivan browsed the fabric, touched everything and bought nothing, as she did 3 times a week. Each transaction was recorded in Juliana's neat hand in the ledger, each payment a small drop against an ocean of debt. Around mid-morning, the door opened, and a man Juliana did not recognize stepped inside. He was perhaps 30 years old, with light brown hair and dust covering his clothing. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing eyes the color of creek water, clear and direct. There was something about him that commanded attention without demanding it, a quiet confidence in the way he moved. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl from somewhere farther south. "I am looking for saddle soap and a good leather oil if you have it." "Second aisle, middle shelf," Juliana replied, her shopkeeper's smile automatic. But as he turned to look, recognition struck her like lightning. The angle of his shoulders, the way he carried himself. This was her cowboy. Up close, real, standing in her father's store, her hands suddenly did not know what to do. She busied herself straightening the counter, rearranging items that did not need rearranging. She could hear him moving through the aisle, the soft footfalls of his boots on the wooden floor. When he returned with his selections, she had to force herself to meet his eyes. "This should do," he said, placing the items on the counter. Then he paused, and that smile from earlier returned, smaller now but somehow more intimate in the close space. "I hope I did not startle you this morning. I have seen you at your window, and I have been working up the courage to acknowledge it for some time. My name is Fletcher Davis." "Juliana Reyes," she managed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "And you did startle me, but not unpleasantly." Fletcher nodded slowly, as if her words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. "I work at the Diamond Creek Ranch. Been there about 4 months now. This is a good town." "It has its moments," Juliana said, then wondered if that sounded too cynical. She forced brightness into her tone. "That will be 40 cents. He paid, counting out the coins into her palm. His fingers were indeed calloused but gentle, exactly as she had imagined. As he gathered his purchases, he hesitated, clearly wanting to say something more. Juliana found herself leaning forward slightly, encouraging him without words. "Miss Reyes," he began, then stopped. Started again. "Would it be too forward of me to ask if I might call on you sometime? Perhaps Sunday afternoon if you are not occupied?" Everything in Juliana wanted to say yes. The word formed on her tongue, ready and eager. But reality intervened, cold and unforgiving. In 3 weeks she would be gone. Starting something now would be foolish, would be cruel to both of them. "I am very flattered, Mr. Davis," she said carefully, "but my circumstances are complicated at present. I do not think it would be wise." Something shifted in his expression, disappointment crossing his features before he schooled them back to politeness. "I understand. Thank you for your time, Miss Reyes." He left, and the store felt immediately emptier. Juliana returned to her ledger, but the numbers swam before her eyes. She had done the right thing, the sensible thing. So why did it feel like she had just made a terrible mistake? The day continued its slow crawl toward closing. Juliana sold goods, made change, swept the floor, and tried not to think about Fletcher Davis or his smile or the way he had asked to call on her with such earnest hope in his voice. When she finally locked the door at sunset, exhaustion dragged at her bones. She climbed the stairs to her small living quarters and made a cold supper that she barely tasted. That night, she pulled out the letter from her aunt in San Francisco and read it again by lamplight. The offer was years old, but it was all she had. She would write tomorrow, explain her situation, and pray that the invitation still stood. A new life waited in California, a place where she could perhaps work as a seamstress or a shop girl. where she would not be the failed daughter of a beloved dreamer, where debt did not press on her shoulders like a physical weight. But when she finally climbed into bed, it was Fletcher's face she saw in the darkness before sleep took her. His smile, the way he had looked at her with such unguarded interest. She told herself it did not matter. By the time summer arrived, he would be a memory, indistinct and faded like an old photograph. Morning came too quickly. Juliana, dressed in her plain brown work dress, pinned her long dark hair into its usual bun and made coffee. She did not go to the window immediately, afraid of what she might feel if she saw him riding past, afraid of what she might feel if he did not appear at all. But at 7:30, habit proved stronger than fear. She stood at her post, cup in hand, and waited. The street below remained empty. 7:35, 7:40. Juliana felt something crumble inside her chest. He was not coming. She had heard him with her refusal, and he had changed his route to avoid passing beneath her window. Just as she turned away, the Palomino mare appeared at the far end of the street. Fletcher sat astride her, same as always, but when he reached the spot below her window, he did not slow. He rode past without looking up, his face forward, his posture straight. Juliana pressed her hand against the cool glass, watching him disappear, feeling the loss more keenly than was reasonable for something that had never truly been hers. She went through the motions of opening the store, helping customers, marking sales. Around noon, the door opened and Elizabeth Garrett swept in, a force of nature dressed in calico and determination. Elizabeth ran the boarding house down the street and considered herself the unofficial keeper of Springerville's social conscience. "Juliana Reyes, you look like you have lost your last friend," Elizabeth announced, her sharp eyes taking in everything. "What is troubling you, girl?" "Nothing, Mrs. Garrett, just tired. Tired my foot. You are eating yourself alive over something." Elizabeth planted her hands on her ample hips. "Does this have anything to do with Fletcher Davis asking around about you?" Juliana's head snapped up. "He was asking about me. Half the town knows he is sweet on you. The man has been working up courage for weeks to even look your direction. Then he finally does, comes in here yesterday and leaves looking like someone kicked his dog." Elizabeth's expression softened slightly. "He is a good man, Juliana. Works hard, sends money back to his mother in Texas, does not drink or gamble. You could do far worse." "I am sure he is wonderful," Juliana said quietly. "But it does not matter. I am leaving Springerville at the end of the month." The words, spoken aloud for the first time, made them real. Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Leaving? Where in heaven's name are you going?" "San Francisco. My aunt is there." "I cannot keep this store afloat, Mrs. Garrett. The debt is too deep. Crowley will take the building regardless, but at least this way I can leave with some dignity." Elizabeth was silent for a long moment, her face working through several emotions. "Your father would be heartbroken." "My father left me this mess," Juliana said, more sharply than she intended. Then she softened, guilt washing through her. "I do not mean to speak ill of him. He was kind and generous, but kindness does not pay bills and generosity does not feed me." "No," Elizabeth agreed slowly. "But love does matter, child, and you are walking away from a chance at it without even giving it a try." 3 weeks, Mrs. Garrett. I have 3 weeks. What kind of love story starts and ends in 3 weeks? The kind that changes your life if you let it." Elizabeth shook her head and moved toward the door. "I will not press you, but I will say this. Fletcher Davis is the kind of man who comes along once if you are lucky. Think hard before you walk away." She left, and Juliana was alone with her thoughts and her ledger and the impossible mathematics of her situation. That evening she wrote to her aunt, explaining everything, asking if the invitation still stood. She posted the letter the next morning and tried not to calculate how long a response would take to arrive. The days developed a new rhythm. Fletcher still rode past each morning, but he no longer looked up. Juliana still stood at her window, but the joy had gone out of the routine. She watched him pass, memorized the straight line of his back, and felt something inside her wither a little more each day. A week passed. 10 days. Juliana began sorting through her father's belongings, deciding what to keep and what to sell. The store's inventory would go to Crowley as part of the settlement. Her personal items would fit in 2 trunks if she was ruthless about what she kept. She found her mother's wedding dress wrapped in paper at the bottom of a chest and sat on the floor holding it, crying for the first time since her father's death. On the 11th day, a Thursday afternoon thick with spring heat, a commotion in the street drew Juliana to the window. A group of men on horseback were riding hard into town, and even from a distance, she could see something was wrong. One of the horses carried double, and the second rider was slumped forward, clearly injured. She ran downstairs and out onto the boardwalk. Other townspeople were emerging, drawn by the noise. The riders pulled up in front of the doctor's office 3 buildings down, and 2 men carefully lifted the injured man from the saddle. As they carried him toward the door, Juliana's heart stopped. It was Fletcher. His shirt was dark with blood on the left side, his face pale and drawn with pain. His eyes were closed, his body limp in his companion's arms. "What happened?" someone shouted. "Cattle thieves up at Diamond Creek," one of the riders answered. "Caught them trying to run off about 30 head. There was shooting. Fletcher took a bullet before we drove them off." The doctor, a gray-haired man named Morrison, appeared and helped carry Fletcher inside. The door swung shut, leaving the crowd on the street murmuring anxiously. Juliana stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth. The world had narrowed to a single point of terror. Fletcher could die. He could die today, and she would never have a chance to tell him that she had been wrong, that turning him away had been the worst decision she had ever made, that these 11 days of watching him ride past without looking up had taught her more about her own heart than she had learned in all the years before. Without thinking, she ran. Her skirts tangled around her legs as she pushed through the crowd and burst through the doctor's door. The outer room was chaos, men tracking in dirt and blood, everyone talking at once. Dr. Morrison looked up from where he was cutting away Fletcher's shirt. "Miss Reyes, this is not a place for a lady right now." "I can help," Juliana said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I assisted my father during the cholera outbreak 2 years ago. I know how to clean wounds and boil instruments and follow instructions. You need an extra pair of hands." Dr. Morrison studied her for a brief moment, then nodded. "Very well. Wash up in that basin. The rest of you men out. Come back in an hour." The cowboys filed out reluctantly, leaving just Juliana, the doctor, and Fletcher unconscious on the examination table. The bullet had entered just below his left shoulder, and blood was flowing freely. Juliana pushed down her fear and focused on what needed to be done. For the next 2 hours, she worked alongside Dr. Morrison with steady hands and determination she did not know she possessed. They cleaned the wound, extracted the bullet, which thankfully had not shattered any bone, stitched the torn flesh, and bandaged him tightly. Fletcher stirred occasionally, moaning with pain, but never fully woke. When it was finally done, they moved him to the small recovery room in the back, and Dr. Morrison left to speak with the cowboys waiting outside. Juliana sat in a chair beside Fletcher's bed and allowed herself to tremble. Now that the crisis had passed, reaction set in. She could have lost him today. This man she barely knew but who had somehow become essential to her peace of mind could have died, and she would have spent the rest of her life regretting her cowardice. She reached out tentatively and touched his hand where it lay on top of the blanket. His fingers were cold, so she wrapped both of her hands around his, trying to warm them. His face in repose looked younger, vulnerable. There was a small scar on his chin she had not noticed before. Stubble darkened his jaw. She wanted to memorize every detail. "Please be all right," she whispered. "Please." Dr. Morrison returned, wiping his hands on a towel. "You did well today, Miss Reyes. He is stable now. Lost a fair bit of blood, but he is young and strong. With proper care and no infection, he should recover fully. Can I stay with him?" The words escaped before Juliana could stop them. The doctor raised his eyebrows but did not seem displeased. "I need to check on Mrs. Whitmore and her baby. If you are willing to sit with him for a few hours, I would be grateful. Call me if he develops a fever or if the bleeding starts again." Juliana nodded, and the doctor left her alone with Fletcher. The afternoon light slanted through the small window, turning the dust motes golden. She sat and held his hand and let herself imagine a different future than the one she had been planning. What if she stayed? What if she let herself care about this man, let herself try to build something here in this small Arizona town with its impossible dust and merciless sun? But then reality intruded, as it always did. The debt was still there. Crowley was still waiting. San Francisco was still her only reasonable option. Staying would mean losing everything her father had built, would mean failure and humiliation. Leaving was the practical choice, the sensible choice. Except sitting here holding Fletcher's hand, feeling the slow, steady beat of his pulse beneath her fingers, sensible felt like a betrayal of something more important than practicality. Evening fell. Dr. Morrison returned and insisted Juliana go home to rest. She walked back to the store in the purple twilight, let herself in, climbed the stairs to her rooms, and sat at her father's old desk without lighting a lamp. Through the window, she could see the first stars emerging in the darkening sky. Her father had believed in kindness over sense, in generosity over caution. He had extended credit when he should have demanded payment, had given away goods to families in need, had measured his success not in dollars, but in the gratitude of his customers. It had ruined him financially, but he had died with the respect and love of the entire town. Juliana had been angry at him for that, angry at being left with debts and impossible choices. But sitting in the darkness, she wondered if perhaps her father had understood something she was only beginning to grasp. Maybe some things were worth more than security. Maybe some risks were worth taking even when the outcome was uncertain. She lit the lamp finally and pulled out her father's ledger. She went through every page, every entry, tallying not just what was owed to them but calculating what they owed to suppliers. The numbers were worse than she had thought. Even if she somehow collected every outstanding debt, it would barely cover half of what was due. The store was truly lost. But as she worked through the figures, an idea began to form. The building itself had value. The inventory had value. If she could convince Crowley to buy her out properly rather than just for closing, if she could negotiate and fight for every dollar, she might walk away with enough to start fresh here rather than fleeing to California. It would not be much, but it might be enough. The question was whether she was brave enough to try. Whether Fletcher Davis and the possibility of something real between them was worth the risk of staying in a place where everyone would know if she failed. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she made lists and plans, calculated and recalculated, built arguments and rebuttals for her imaginary confrontation with Crowley. When dawn came, she was exhausted but clear-headed. She had made her decision. At 7:30, she did not stand at her window. Instead, she was already dressed and ready, walking down the street toward Dr. Morrison's office. She let herself in quietly and found Fletcher's room. He was awake, propped up slightly on pillows, his face still pale but his eyes alert. "Miss Reyes," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" Juliana pulled the chair close to his bed and sat down, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. "I came to apologize and to tell you something I should have said when you first asked." Fletcher watched her carefully, wariness and hope warring in his expression. She took a breath and continued. "When you asked to call on me, I said no because I was planning to leave Springerville. My father left the store in terrible debt, and I saw no way forward except to run away to San Francisco, where I have an aunt. I thought staying would mean failure and humiliation, and leaving would mean a fresh start." She paused, gathering courage. "But then yesterday, when I saw you hurt and bleeding, I realized that I was about to make the worst mistake of my life. I was about to walk away from the possibility of something real because I was afraid." "And now?" Fletcher asked quietly. "Now I am still afraid," Juliana admitted. "The debt is still there, the problems have not gone away. But I realized that my father lived his whole life choosing kindness over caution, and maybe he was not as foolish as I thought. Maybe some things are worth fighting for even when the odds are bad." Fletcher reached out with his good arm and took her hand. His grip was weak but warm. "What are you saying, Juliana?" "I am saying that I would very much like you to call on me when you are recovered. I am saying that I am going to stay in Springerville and fight for what is mine, even if I fail. I am saying that I have been watching you ride past my window for 3 months, and when you finally looked up and smiled at me, something changed. I want to know where that change might lead." The smile that spread across Fletcher's face was worth every moment of fear and uncertainty. "I would be honored to call on you," he said. "And for what it is worth, I think your father was a wise man. Kindness is never foolish." Dr. Morrison chose that moment to enter, breaking the intimacy of the moment but not diminishing it. He checked Fletcher's wound, pronounced him on the mend, and gave strict instructions about rest and limited movement. Juliana listened carefully, already planning how she would help during his recovery. Over the next 2 weeks, a new routine established itself. Juliana ran the store during the day, then spent her evenings at Dr. Morrison's office with Fletcher. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up in Texas, about his mother who still lived in a small house outside Houston, about his decision to come west looking for opportunity and adventure. She told him about her father's dreams, about her mother who had died when Juliana was 12, about the complicated love she felt for the store that had been both her inheritance and her burden. Fletcher recovered quickly, his youth and strength serving him well. Within a week, he was sitting up easily. Within 10 days, he was walking short distances. The cowboys from Diamond Creek visited regularly, bringing news from the ranch and treating Juliana with a respect that spoke to how highly they thought of Fletcher. But looming over everything was Juliana's meeting with Crowley, which she had scheduled for the end of the month. She prepared meticulously, gathering every document, every ledger, every scrap of paper that might help her case. Fletcher offered to come with her for moral support, but he was still too weak. Instead, Elizabeth Garrett agreed to accompany her, her formidable presence a comfort. The morning of the meeting, Juliana dressed in her best dress, a dark blue cotton that had been her mother's. She pinned her hair carefully, forced down some breakfast, and met Elizabeth in front of the bank at 9 o'clock sharp. Crowley's office was all dark wood and leather, designed to intimidate. The banker himself was a thin man with watery eyes and a tendency to steeple his fingers while he talked. He greeted them with false warmth and gestured to the chairs across from his massive desk. "Miss Reyes, I am glad you have come to discuss our business. I trust you have accepted the inevitable and are ready to sign the transfer papers." "Actually, Mr. Crowley, I am here to negotiate," Juliana said, pleased that her voice came out steady and strong. "The property has considerable value, as does the remaining inventory. I believe a fair sale price would be $1,500. Crowley's laugh was unpleasant. "My dear girl, you owe this bank $2,000. The property will barely cover that debt. You will walk away with nothing, but at least you will walk away free of obligation." "The property is worth at least $1,800, Juliana countered. She pulled out a document she had carefully prepared. "I have here assessments from 3 different sources confirming that value. The inventory is worth another $500 at minimum. That is $2,300 in total value. Subtract the $2,000 owed, and you should be paying me $300. "Those assessments are meaningless," Crowley said dismissively. "I could bring in assessors who would value it at $1,000. You could, but you would be lying." Elizabeth spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through Crowley's bluster like a knife. "Everyone in this town knows that property is valuable. It is on the best corner of Main Street, the building is solid, and Diego Reyes spent years building up his customer base. You are planning to turn it into another bank branch, which means you already know it is worth more than you are offering." Crowley's expression hardened. "Mrs. Garrett, this is a private business matter." "Nothing is private in a town this size," Elizabeth replied. "And the territorial judge, who happens to be a friend of mine, would be very interested to hear if you are cheating a young woman out of her rightful inheritance. He takes a dim view of such things." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Crowley looked between the 2 women, clearly reassessing. Juliana pressed her advantage. "I am not asking for charity, Mr. Crowley. I am asking for fairness. Pay me $300, take the property and inventory, and we will both walk away satisfied. Refuse, and I will take this to the territorial court. It will cost you time, money, and reputation, and you will likely end up paying more in the end." The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then Crowley sighed and pulled out a ledger. $200. "That is my final offer. $250 and you have a deal. $225. Juliana glanced at Elizabeth, who nodded slightly. "Agreed." The paperwork took another hour to complete, but when Juliana walked out of the bank, she carried a bank draft for $225. It was not a fortune, but it was a start. More importantly, it was hers, earned through courage and negotiation rather than accepted as charity. Elizabeth hugged her on the boardwalk. "Your father would be proud. You stood your ground and got what was fair." "I could not have done it without you," Juliana said gratefully. "Nonsense. You had the spine, I was just decoration." Elizabeth smiled warmly. "Now, what will you do with your windfall?" Juliana had been thinking about that very question. "I am going to find a small place to rent, something modest, and I am going to look for work. Maybe someone needs a bookkeeper or a shop assistant. It will not be easy, but it will be mine." That afternoon, she went to tell Fletcher the news. She found him sitting outside Dr. Morrison's office in the shade, his arm still in a sling but color returned to his face. When she told him about the meeting with Crowley, about the negotiation and the settlement, his pride was evident and warming. "You are remarkable," he said simply. "Most people would have accepted whatever was offered." "I had a good teacher," Juliana replied, thinking of her father. "He taught me that kindness is not the same as weakness." Fletcher reached out and took her hand. It had become natural between them, these small touches, the easy intimacy of 2 people learning each other. "I have been thinking," he said carefully. "Doctor Morrison says I can return to light work next week. The ranch has offered me my job back, but I have been considering other options." What kind of options? I have some money saved. Not much, but enough to start something small. I have always wanted to own land, maybe run a few horses. Train them and sell them. There is good money in that if you know what you are doing, and I grew up around horses. He paused, his eyes searching her face. But it would mean staying in Springerville long term, building something from nothing. It would not be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is, Juliana said softly. Something was shifting between them, the conversation taking on weight and significance. If you stayed, where would you build this horse ranch? There is a piece of land about 3 miles out of town, along Diamond Creek. 20 acres with good water and grazing. The owner is willing to sell cheap because he is moving to California. I have been thinking about it for weeks. Fletcher's grip tightened on her hand, but I did not want to make any decisions until I knew whether you would be here. Whether you would let me court you properly, whether there might be a future for us. Juliana's heart felt too large for her chest. They had known each other for such a short time, and yet it felt like she had been waiting for him for years. I would like that very much, she said. All of it. Fletcher pulled her closer, and despite his injured arm, despite being in public view, he kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, and when they parted, Juliana was smiling so widely her face hurt. The next week unfolded with the particular magic of new love combined with spring in the desert. Fletcher returned to light work at the ranch, saving his wages and planning for his future horse operation. Juliana found work keeping books for 3 different businesses in town, enough combined income to rent a small house on the edge of Springerville. It was nothing fancy, just 3 rooms and a kitchen, but it was hers and she loved it fiercely. Fletcher called on her every Sunday, and they spent long afternoons walking along the creek, talking about their dreams and plans. He told her about the horses he wanted to raise, about his vision for training them not just to be ridden but to be partners with their handlers. She told him about possibly starting a small lending library, about her love of books and learning. They shared their fears and hopes with the honesty of people who had already decided they were in this together for the long haul. By summer, Fletcher had saved enough to make an offer on the land along Diamond Creek. The owner accepted, and suddenly their abstract plans became concrete reality. Juliana went with him the day he signed the papers, and they stood together on the dusty property, looking at the scrub grass and scattered trees and the creek running along the eastern border. It does not look like much yet, Fletcher said, but his voice was full of wonder. It looks like home, Juliana replied, and she meant it. They broke ground on a small house in July. Friends from town and cowboys from the ranch came to help during their free time, and the structure rose slowly but steadily. It was a simple design, 2 rooms initially with space to add on later. Fletcher did most of the work himself, his shoulder fully healed now, his body growing stronger from the physical labor. Juliana came after her bookkeeping work finished each day, bringing food and water and helping where she could. On a hot August evening, as the sun set in brilliant oranges and reds, Fletcher set down his hammer and climbed down from the roof where he had been laying shingles. He was dusty and exhausted, his shirt soaked with sweat, but his eyes were bright as he approached Juliana where she sat on a pile of lumber. "We need to talk about something," he said, and despite his casual tone, Juliana could hear the nervousness underneath. "What is it?" Fletcher knelt in front of her, taking both her hands in his. "I know we have not been courting very long by traditional standards. 5 months is not much time to really know someone. But I feel like I have known you forever, like I was just waiting for that morning when you looked out your window and I finally had the courage to smile at you." He paused, gathering his words. "I love you, Juliana. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you fight for what matters. I love how you see possibilities where others see problems. I love who I am when I am with you." Tears were already flowing down Juliana's cheeks, but she was smiling through them. Fletcher continued, "I do not have much to offer yet. This house is not finished. The horse operation is just a dream, and I am still working to save enough to buy our first breeding pair. But what I do have, I want to share with you. I want to build this life together, face whatever comes side by side." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," Juliana said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had always been meant to be there. Then he stood and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around as she laughed. When he set her down, they kissed in the golden light of sunset, surrounded by the skeleton of their future home, the sound of the creek providing a gentle soundtrack. They were married in September, a simple ceremony in the small church at the center of Springerville. Elizabeth Garrett cried openly, declaring it the most romantic thing she had witnessed in decades. Dr. Morrison attended, pleased to see his former patient so thoroughly recovered and happy. The Cowboys from Diamond Creek came, along with what seemed like half the town. Diego Reyes would have been proud to see how many lives he had touched, how many people came to celebrate his daughter's new beginning. Juliana wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit. Fletcher wore a new suit bought specially for the occasion, his hair slicked back, his eyes never leaving his bride. When they spoke their vows, promising to love and honor each other through whatever came, there was not a dry eye in the church. The house was finished enough to move into by October. It was sparse inside, furnished with a bed frame Fletcher built himself, a table and chairs that Elizabeth donated, and various items gifted by generous neighbors. But it was theirs, earned through hard work and determination, and they had never been happier than in those first weeks of marriage. Fletcher worked on building fences and a small stable while continuing to work part-time at Diamond Creek. His reputation as an excellent horseman had spread, and people began asking him to help train difficult animals. He discovered a gift for it, a patience and intuition that made even the most skittish horses trust him. The extra income helped them save toward buying their first horses. Juliana continued her bookkeeping work, expanding her client base throughout the autumn. She was good at it, meticulous and trustworthy, and word spread. By winter, she was turning down work because she had more offers than she could handle. She began thinking about taking on an apprentice, teaching someone else the trade, but that was a plan for the future. Their first Christmas together was quiet and perfect. They could not afford much in the way of gifts, so they made them for each other. Fletcher carved Juliana a beautiful wooden box for her correspondence, inlaid with a pattern of horses running. Juliana sewed him a heavy winter coat lined with wool, painstakingly stitching every seam by lamplight after he fell asleep. When they exchanged these gifts on Christmas morning, both of them cried at the thoughtfulness and care evident in every detail. In January, Fletcher came home from town with barely contained excitement. A ranch 30 miles west was selling off some of its stock, including a proven breeding pair of quarter horses at a price he could almost afford. He laid out the figures for Juliana, showing her how if they used most of their savings and he took on extra work breaking horses for other ranchers, they could make it work. "It is risky," he admitted. "If anything goes wrong, we will be in a difficult position." Juliana studied the numbers, thinking of her father and his willingness to take risks for things that mattered. "My father believed that you cannot build anything worthwhile without taking chances. I think we should do it." They bought the horses, a magnificent stallion named Ranger and a mare named Daisy. Fletcher brought them home in February, and Juliana swore she had never seen him happier than when he led them into the completed stable. He spent hours working with them, talking to them, building trust and partnership. In the evenings, he would tell Juliana about their progress, about his plans for training their future foals, about his vision for eventually having a whole herd of exceptional horses. Spring came again, marking a year since that morning when Fletcher had finally looked up at Juliana's window and smiled. They celebrated their anniversary of sorts by riding out to a high point overlooking their property. The land was transforming under Fletcher's careful stewardship. The fences were complete, the stable expanded, pasture grass planted and growing green with spring rain. In the distance, Ranger and Daisy grazed peacefully. "A year ago I thought my life was over," Juliana said, leaning against Fletcher's chest as they sat on the hillside. "I thought leaving was my only option. A year ago, I thought I would never have the courage to even speak to you," Fletcher replied, his arms wrapped around her. "I used to ride past your window hoping you would notice me, telling myself that tomorrow I would wave or stop or say something. It took me 3 months to work up the nerve. I am glad you finally did. I am glad I was brave enough to stay." Juliana turned in his arms to face him. "And I have something to tell you that I hope will make you happy." Something in her tone made Fletcher study her face carefully. "What is it?" "I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." The joy that transformed his face was incandescent. He kissed her deeply, laughing against her lips, then pulled back to look at her with wonder. "Are you sure?" "When? I am sure. The baby should come in late autumn, probably October or early November." Fletcher placed his hand gently on her stomach, even though there was nothing to feel yet. "We are going to be parents," he said, as if testing the words. "We are going to have a family." "We already are a family," Juliana corrected gently. "This just makes us bigger." The months of Juliana's pregnancy passed in a haze of preparation and anticipation. Fletcher built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as glass, carving their initials and the baby's expected birth date into the headboard. Juliana sewed tiny clothes and blankets, marveling at how small the garments were. Elizabeth visited often, bringing advice and supplies and her own special brand of enthusiastic support. In May, Daisy gave birth to a strong colt that Fletcher named Promise. The birth went smoothly, and watching Fletcher help the mare through the process gave Juliana confidence about her own upcoming delivery. He was gentle and patient, encouraging and calm, and she knew he would be an excellent father. Summer brought challenges. The heat was oppressive, and Juliana grew large and uncomfortable. But Fletcher was attentive and caring, taking on extra household tasks without complaint, making sure she stayed cool and hydrated. His horse training business was thriving now, with ranchers from all over the territory bringing him difficult animals. He had to turn down work to stay close to home as Juliana's due date approached, but he did so without hesitation. "The horses will always be there," he told her when she protested. "But you are only going to have our first baby once, and I am not missing a moment of it." On a cool October evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of purple and gold, Juliana felt the first labor pains. Fletcher rode to town immediately to fetch Dr. Morrison and Elizabeth, then returned to stay by Juliana's side. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Dr. Morrison remained calm and encouraging throughout, and Elizabeth provided practical support and comfort. Finally, as afternoon sun streamed through the bedroom window, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that spoke of strength and health. Fletcher held him for the first time with tears streaming down his face, looking at his wife with such love and gratitude that Dr. Morrison had to turn away and wipe his own eyes. "What should we name him?" Fletcher asked. They had discussed names for months without deciding. But looking at her husband holding their son, Juliana suddenly knew. "Diego, after my father. Diego Daniel Davis." Fletcher nodded, understanding the significance. "Diego Daniel, welcome to the world, little one." The baby was perfect, with Fletcher's light hair and what would eventually be Juliana's dark eyes. He nursed eagerly and slept peacefully, already showing the calm temperament that would characterize his early years. Fletcher could barely stand to put him down, constantly wanting to hold him, study his tiny features, marvel at his very existence. As autumn turned to winter, they settled into the rhythms of new parenthood. Juliana recovered her strength while Fletcher juggled caring for his family with maintaining the horse operation. It was exhausting and exhilarating, challenging and rewarding, everything they had hoped for and more. Diego grew from infant to baby, reaching each milestone with his parents' proud encouragement. He smiled at 2 months, rolled over at 4, sat up at 6. Fletcher would place him in a basket in the stable while he worked, talking to the baby constantly about the horses. Juliana would find them there in the evenings, Diego watching his father with wide eyes, Fletcher explaining everything he was doing as if his son could understand every word. "You are going to turn him into a horseman before he can walk," Juliana teased. "Nothing wrong with that," Fletcher replied, grinning. "Besides, he loves it. Look at how he watches." And it was true. Even as a baby, Diego seemed fascinated by the animals, reaching out toward them with chubby hands, making happy sounds when they came near. 2 years passed in a blur of growth and building and joy. The horse operation expanded as Fletcher's reputation grew. They bought more land, expanded the stable, and acquired 2 more breeding mares. Juliana took on an apprentice bookkeeper, a young widow named Sarah who needed the work and showed real aptitude for the trade. Life was full and rich and satisfying. Diego's 2nd birthday brought the entire community to their property for a celebration. Long tables were set up in the yard, filled with food that people brought to share. Children ran wild while adults talked and laughed. As Juliana watched Fletcher swinging Diego in his arms, both of them laughing, she felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. Elizabeth found her standing alone for a moment, lost in thought. "You look happy, child." "I am. I really, truly am." Juliana smiled at her friend. "Do you remember that day in the store when you told me Fletcher was the kind of man who comes along once if you are lucky? You were right." "Of course I was right. I am always right." Elizabeth's sharp tone was softened by affection. "But you were the one brave enough to take the chance. You could have run to San Francisco and spent your whole life wondering what if." "I nearly did," Juliana admitted. "If Fletcher had not been hurt that day, if I had not realized I could lose him before I ever really had him, I probably would have left. But you did not. You stayed and fought and built something beautiful." Elizabeth squeezed her hand. "Your father would be so proud of who you have become." That night, after all the guests had left and Diego was asleep in his cradle, Fletcher and Juliana sat on their porch watching the stars emerge. The desert night was cool and quiet, broken only by the occasional sound of horses moving in their pasture. "I have been thinking," Fletcher said, "about the future, about what comes next. And what did you conclude? That I want more of this, more of us, more family, more building together." He turned to look at her. "I want Diego to have siblings. I want to keep expanding the ranch. I want to grow old with you right here, watching our grandchildren play in the same dirt where our children played." "That sounds perfect," Juliana said. She paused, then added with a smile, And it is good that you want more children because we are having another one. I am due in the spring." Fletcher whooped with joy, pulling her close and kissing her soundly. "How long have you known?" "A few weeks. I wanted to be certain before I told you." "We are going to need a bigger house," Fletcher said, already planning. "And another bedroom, maybe two. If we keep this up, we will need quite a lot of space." Juliana laughed, relaxing into his embrace. "One step at a time. Let us see how we handle two before we plan for a dozen." Their daughter was born in May, a spring baby with dark hair and her father's creek water eyes. They named her Lily Rose, and she was everything her brother was not, loud and demanding and utterly captivating. Diego, now 2.5, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, constantly bringing her toys and trying to share his food with her. The years that followed brought both challenges and triumphs. There was the summer of the drought when they nearly lost the horse operation, saved only by Fletcher's willingness to take on dangerous work breaking wild mustangs for the army. There was the winter when Diego got pneumonia and they nearly lost him, Juliana sitting up for 3 days straight while Dr. Morrison fought to bring down the fever. There was the joy of watching their children grow, of Lily's first steps and Diego's first ride on a gentle mare, of family dinners and celebrations and quiet evenings. Fletcher's horse ranch became one of the most respected in the territory. He developed a training method that was revolutionary for its gentleness and effectiveness, and people came from as far as New Mexico and California to buy his horses or learn his techniques. He published a small pamphlet on his methods that sold surprisingly well, bringing in additional income and spreading his reputation further. Juliana's bookkeeping business evolved into a small accounting firm. She trained 3 apprentices over the years, young women who needed the work and the independence it provided. She became known not just for her skills with numbers, but for her fairness and discretion. Business owners throughout the region sought her advice on financial matters, and she helped more than one struggling enterprise avoid the fate that had nearly befallen her father's store. When Diego was 7 and Lily was 4, they welcomed another child, a son they named Samuel James. He was a happy baby, easygoing and content, and he completed their family in a way they had not realized was missing. Fletcher declared that 3 was a perfect number, and Juliana agreed, grateful for her children but also ready to be done with pregnancies and infants. The children grew up surrounded by horses and open space, learning responsibility and hard work from early ages. Diego showed his father's natural gift with animals, able to calm a nervous horse with a touch and a whispered word. Lily was more interested in the business side, following her mother around with questions about accounting and negotiations. Samuel was still young, but he showed signs of being a natural builder, constantly constructing things from whatever materials he could find. On a September morning in 1893, 10 years after Fletcher had first smiled up at Juliana's window, they stood together on the same hillside where he had proposed and where she had told him about their first pregnancy. The view had changed dramatically. Their house had been expanded twice and now sprawled comfortably across its foundations. The stable complex housed 20 horses, with paddocks and pastures spreading out in every direction. In the distance, they could see their children playing near the creek, Diego teaching his younger siblings how to skip stones. "You ever regret it?" Fletcher asked. "Staying here, choosing this life?" Juliana leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, and considered the question seriously. "Not for a single moment. This life, this family, everything we have built together, it is more than I ever dreamed possible. Even though we started with nothing. Even though it has been hard at times, especially because of that. Juliana turned to face him, reaching up to touch his face. The years had added lines around his eyes and gray to his temples, but to her, he was as handsome as the day she first saw him smile. "We built this together, Fletcher. Every fence post and floorboard, every horse trained and ledger balanced, we did it side by side. That makes it ours in a way nothing handed to us could ever be." Fletcher kissed her, a kiss full of 10 years of partnership and love and commitment. When they parted, he said, "I rode past your window for 3 months before I had the courage to look up. I wasted so much time being afraid." "You were not wasting time. You were waiting for the right moment," Juliana smiled. "And I was waiting too, even though I did not know it. I was waiting for someone brave enough to see me, stubborn enough to pursue me even when I pushed him away, and patient enough to let me find my own courage." "You remember what you were thinking that morning when I finally looked up?" Juliana laughed. "I was thinking that I was about to leave town forever and that you were the most interesting thing that had happened to me in months. I was thinking that I had wasted all that time watching you when I could have been getting to know you. I was thinking that I was a fool. And now I am thinking that everything happened exactly as it was meant to. If you had looked up sooner, maybe I would not have been ready. If I had not been planning to leave, maybe I would not have realized how much I wanted to stay. All of it, even the hard parts, led us here." She gestured at the vista before them, their property and their children and the life they had made. "And I would not change a single thing." They stood there for a long time, watching their children play, the horses graze, the sun move across the Arizona sky. This land had seemed so harsh and unforgiving when Juliana had first contemplated leaving it. But love and determination had transformed it into home, had revealed beauty and possibility where she had only seen difficulty. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they walked back down the hillside hand in hand. Diego ran to meet them, excited about a bird's nest he had found. Lily demanded to know what was for dinner. Samuel showed them a tower he had built from creek stones. Fletcher swung Samuel onto his shoulders while Juliana took Lily's hand, and together they walked toward the house, a family complete and content. That evening, after the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Juliana stood at the bedroom window looking out at the starlit desert. Fletcher came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "That morning," she replied, "when you finally looked up and smiled. I think that was the moment my life really began. Everything before was preparation. Everything after has been becoming who I was meant to be." "I was terrified," Fletcher admitted. "I almost rode past like I had every other day, but something made me stop, made me look up. Maybe it was fate. Or maybe it was courage," Juliana said. "The same courage that made me stay when everything told me to run. The same courage we have shown each other every day since." Fletcher turned her in his arms so they were face to face. "I love you, Juliana Davis. I have loved you since before I knew your name, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Juliana whispered. "Thank you for looking up. Thank you for smiling. Thank you for seeing me." They stood together at the window, looking out at the land they had claimed and shaped, at the life they had built from determination and hope and love. In the distance, a coyote called to the moon. Closer by, one of the horses whinnied softly. The desert night embraced them, familiar now, home in every way that mattered. Years continued to pass, each one adding depth and richness to their story. Diego grew into a young man with his father's gift for horses and his mother's head for business. At 18, he began taking on more responsibility for the training operation, eventually developing his own specialty in working with horses traumatized by poor treatment. His patience and empathy made him sought after throughout the territory. Lily surprised everyone by announcing at 15 that she wanted to study law. It was an unusual ambition for a young woman in 1898, but Juliana and Fletcher had always encouraged their children to pursue their passions. They sent her to school in Phoenix, where she excelled, and eventually became one of the first female lawyers in the Arizona Territory, specializing in property rights and business law. Samuel followed his love of building into carpentry, and then architecture, designing houses and barns throughout the region that were both beautiful and practical. His work was characterized by an understanding of how people and animals needed to live in the harsh desert climate, and he developed innovations in ventilation and shade that were widely copied. As their children grew and established their own lives, Fletcher and Juliana found themselves entering a new phase of their relationship. They were no longer young parents struggling to build something from nothing. They were established, respected members of their community, their ranch a landmark, their business advice sought by younger couples starting out. But they never forgot where they started. They helped young families in the same situation Juliana had been in after her father's death, offering advice and sometimes financial assistance to those drowning in debt. They employed young men with nowhere else to go, teaching them the horse trade and giving them a chance to build their own futures. They donated to the school and the church, sponsored community events, and generally lived the life of generosity that Diego Reyes had exemplified. In 1903, on their 20th wedding anniversary, their children surprised them with a party attended by what seemed like everyone in Springerville and the surrounding ranches. The celebration was held at the ranch, with long tables of food, music, dancing, and testimonials from people whose lives Fletcher and Juliana had touched. Elizabeth Garrett, now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, stood to speak. 20 years ago, I watched a stubborn young woman nearly make the worst mistake of her life. She was planning to run away from everything her father had built, to flee to California rather than face her fears. Elizabeth's eyes found Juliana in the crowd, but she found her courage. She stayed and fought and built something even more remarkable than her father had dreamed, and she did it alongside a man who saw her truly from the very beginning, who loved her stubbornly and well. She raised her glass. To Juliana and Fletcher, who prove every day that the best love stories are the ones we have courage enough to live. The toast was drunk with enthusiasm, and then Fletcher stood to speak. He had never been comfortable with public speaking, but his love for his wife gave him eloquence. 20 years ago, I rode past a window every morning, hoping a woman I had never met would notice me. I was lonely and uncertain, new to this territory, unsure of my place in the world. But every morning I saw her standing there, and she became my anchor, my routine, the thing I looked forward to. He found Juliana's eyes across the room. It took me 3 months to work up the courage to look up and smile, and when I finally did, when she smiled back, I knew my life had just changed forever. I just did not know how much or how beautifully. His voice thickened with emotion. Everything good in my life flows from that moment. Our children, our home, our partnership, all of it started because one morning I was brave enough to look up, and she was brave enough to stay. I thank God every day for that courage, for hers and for mine and for the grace that brought us together. There was not a dry eye in the crowd as Fletcher crossed the room to his wife and kissed her while everyone cheered. Juliana held him tight, overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they had built, for the courage they had shown each other, for the love that had sustained them through challenges and triumphs alike. The party continued late into the night, with music and dancing under the stars. Juliana danced with her husband, with her sons, with old friends and neighbors. She watched Lily laughing with her colleagues from Phoenix, watched Diego teaching a young woman from town how to waltz, watched Samuel debating building techniques with a group of ranchers. This was her legacy, she realized. Not just the business or the property, but this family, these relationships, this community they had helped build and sustain. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Fletcher and Juliana found themselves alone on their porch, watching the last stragglers head home. The desert night was cool and clear, stars blazing overhead in impossible numbers. 20 years, Juliana mused. It seems like forever and no time at all. The best 20 years of my life, Fletcher replied, and I am looking forward to the next 20. And the 20 after that, Juliana added. Growing old with you is going to be an adventure. Everything with you is an adventure. Fletcher pulled her close. Even the quiet moments, even the ordinary days, you make everything better just by being there. They stood in comfortable silence, the kind of peace that comes from truly knowing another person, from sharing a life so completely that words become almost unnecessary. This was what that smile had led to all those years ago. This partnership, this love, this life of meaning and purpose. The years continued their march. Diego married a teacher from Springerville, a practical woman named Margaret who shared his love of horses and the land. They built a house on the northern edge of the ranch property and began having children of their own, giving Fletcher and Juliana their first grandchildren. The joy of being grandparents, of watching their son experience fatherhood, of passing on the lessons they had learned, was profound and sweet. Lily practiced law in Phoenix, but returned often, eventually marrying a fellow lawyer and settling in Springerville to raise their family closer to her roots. She took on cases defending small ranchers and business owners, using her skills to help those who might otherwise be taken advantage of by bigger interests. She was fierce and brilliant, and her parents could not have been prouder. Samuel traveled extensively for his work, designing buildings throughout the Southwest, but he always considered the ranch home. He never married, declaring that his buildings were his children, but he was a beloved uncle to his nieces and nephews, teaching them about design and construction, encouraging their creativity and curiosity. Fletcher's hair turned white, and his hands developed arthritis that made detailed work difficult. But he still rode every morning, checking on the horses, overseeing the operation that Diego now ran day to day. His reputation had spread far beyond Arizona, and his training methods were being taught in schools and military academies. He published a book on horse training that became a standard text, though he remained humble about his accomplishments. Juliana's accounting firm was now run by her former apprentices, though she still consulted on difficult cases. Her real passion in these later years became education. She worked with the territorial government to establish better schools in rural areas, donated books and supplies, and personally tutored young people who showed promise but lacked resources. She had never forgotten her father's generosity or the chances people had given her, and she was determined to pass that forward. In 1913, 30 years after they met, Fletcher and Juliana took a trip back east to visit his mother in Texas. She was elderly now but still sharp, and meeting her was a joy for Juliana. The old woman took her hand and said, "I knew from Fletcher's letters that you were special. But seeing you together, seeing what you have built, it is more than I ever dreamed for my son. Thank you for making him so happy." On the train ride back to Arizona, Fletcher and Juliana talked about their journey, about how far they had come from those early days of struggle and uncertainty. They were in their 50s now, their children grown, their legacy secure. But their love felt as fresh and essential as it had in those first days of courtship. "You ever think about that morning?" Juliana asked, watching the landscape roll past the window. "About what might have happened if you had not looked up?" "All the time," Fletcher admitted. "I think about how close we came to never meeting, to missing each other entirely. It terrifies me, honestly, to think of living my whole life without ever knowing you." "But you did look up," Juliana said firmly, "and I did stay, and we did build this life together. That is what matters. Not the what-ifs, but the what-is." Fletcher took her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis. "What is that I love you more now than I did 30 years ago. What is that every day with you has been a gift. What is that I would do it all again, every struggle and challenge, just to end up here with you." Juliana leaned her head on his shoulder, content and complete. "So would I, every single moment." They returned to Springerville to find their grandchildren had organized a surprise welcome home party. The house was full of children and noise and laughter, and Fletcher and Juliana fell into the comfortable chaos with joy. This was what they had built, this legacy of love and family and commitment. The years rolled on, each one bringing changes. Arizona became a state in 1912, a momentous occasion celebrated throughout the territory. The ranch continued to thrive under Diego's management, expanding to include a breeding program that produced some of the finest horses in the Southwest. Juliana's educational initiatives resulted in 3 new schools being built in rural areas, bringing learning to children who had never had access before. But time takes its toll on everyone, and in the spring of 1920, Fletcher suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed on his right side. It was a devastating blow for a man who had always defined himself by physical work and independence. Juliana devoted herself to his care and rehabilitation, working with him daily on exercises that slowly, painstakingly brought back some function. Through it all, their love remained constant. Fletcher would joke that he had spent their whole marriage looking up to her, and now he literally needed her help to stand. Juliana would reply that she had been looking down at him from her window for 3 months before they met, so this was just a return to form. Their humor, their partnership, their deep knowledge of each other carried them through even this challenge. Fletcher recovered enough to walk with a cane and ride in a buggy, though his days of working horses were over. Instead, he focused on teaching, holding informal classes for young trainers, passing on everything he had learned over 4 decades. His mind remained sharp, and his knowledge was in high demand. On a morning in September 1923, 40 years after Fletcher had first smiled up at Juliana's window, they sat together on their porch watching the sunrise. They were in their 60s now, their bodies slower but their spirits undiminished. The ranch bustled with activity even this early, Diego and his sons already working with the horses, grandchildren running and playing, life continuing its beautiful, messy unfolding. 40 years, Juliana said, echoing a conversation from decades before. Half a lifetime. "The better half," Fletcher replied. His speech was still slightly slurred from the stroke, but she understood him perfectly, as she always had. "The half that mattered." "All of it mattered," Juliana corrected gently. "Everything that came before brought us to that moment when you looked up. And everything after has been the reward for our courage." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the desert in golds and reds. A young horse galloped through the nearest pasture, powerful and free. Children's laughter rang out from somewhere behind the house. The smell of breakfast cooking wafted through the open door. "If I could go back," Fletcher said slowly, working through each word, "and tell my younger self anything, I would say this: Look up sooner. Do not wait 3 months. Every moment with her is precious, and you should not waste a single one. And I would tell my younger self to trust more quickly, Juliana replied, to not let fear make my decisions, to believe that some things are worth the risk. She took his hand, but we got there eventually. We found each other, and we built something beautiful. We did. Fletcher squeezed her hand with what strength remained in his left side. We really did. As the sun cleared the horizon, flooding their porch with golden light, Fletcher turned to look at his wife. Age had added lines to her face and silver to her hair, but to him, she was as beautiful as the day he first saw her standing at her window, backlit by lamplight, watching the world below. He smiled at her, the same smile that had started everything 4 decades ago. Juliana smiled back, her dark eyes warm with love and memory and the particular contentment of a life well lived. This moment, simple and quiet, contained everything that mattered. Their history, their present, their love. They remained on the porch as the ranch woke fully around them, as their family began another day, as life continued its eternal dance of challenge and reward, loss and renewal, ordinary moments and extraordinary love. They had started with nothing but courage and hope. They had built an empire of the heart, a legacy measured not in acres or dollars but in children raised and horses trained and lives touched and love shared. The sun rose higher, warming the cool morning air. Fletcher and Juliana sat together, hand in hand, watching the world they had made together unfold before them. And they were content, deeply and truly content, knowing that 40 years ago a simple smile and an answered gaze had led to this. A life of meaning, a love of substance, a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger each time. This was what happened when courage met courage, when one person looked up and another chose to stay. This was the reward for facing fear, for fighting against the easy answer, for believing that love was worth the risk. This was their story, and it was beautiful, and it was enough, and it was everything.